Good morning, everybody. We're glad to see you this morning. Can you stand up on your feet? We're time to give God praise for Black History Month.
Oh shall overcome.
That's it.
We shall overcome someday. Deep in my heart, I you so much. That was amazing. Give him another round of applause. That is the Jonathan Pettis Chorale. These are all our Morgan students, so this is just very exciting. My name is Natasha Lewis-Williams. I'm the coordinator for Student Life and Development and the advisor to the Student Government Association. On behalf of our illustrious President, Dr. David Wilson, and our Vice President for Student Affairs, Dr. Kevin Banks, we bring you greetings. Our Frederick Douglass Convocation is very special because it's the only convocation planned and executed by students only. So that's and our senior class, they have done a phenomenal job planning this program. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our Vice President for the senior class, Ms. Morgan James. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy that you guys could be here. Give a hand clap just for yourselves for being here and supporting us Morgan students. So today, as Ms. Williams said before, this is the Frederick Douglass Convocation. This is a very special convocation in the eyes of Morgan State University students, especially because we are at HBCU. Our history is so, it's encompassing in everything that comes with Frederick Douglass, the Civil Rights Movement, everything that is our Black history. Being that it's Black History Month is the perfect time to have it. And also today happens to be Valentine's Day, so we're spreading the love all day today. And we love Black History Month and we love our HBCU. So again, I'm so happy for you guys to be here today. I hope you guys enjoy yourselves. We are more than happy to have you. I hope you guys have a fantastic time. Thank you guys for all coming. And now I will introduce our next act, which will be the Byers Dance Academy. Give them a round of applause.
Most important and crucial period of your lives, for what you do now and what you decide now at this age may well determine which way your life shall go. And the question is whether you have a proper, a solid, and a sound blueprint. And I want to suggest some of the things that should be in your life's blueprint. Number one, in your life's blueprint should be a deep belief in your own dignity, your own worth, and your own somebodyness. Don't allow anybody to make you feel that you are nobody. Always feel that you count. Always feel that you have worth. And always feel that your life has ultimate significance. Secondly, in your life's blueprint, you must have, as a basic principle, the determination to achieve excellence in your various fields of endeavor. You're going to be deciding as the days and the years unfold what you will do in life, what your life's work will be. Once you discover what it will be, set out to do it, and to do it well. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a highway, just be a trail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. For it isn't by signs that you win or you fail. Be the best of whatever you are. Finally, in your life's blueprint must be a commitment to the eternal principles of beauty, love, and justice. Well, like none of us has been a Christmas staff, we must keep going. If you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. But by all means, keep moving.
Another hand of applause. Good morning, everyone. I am Imani Majors, and I currently serve as the senior class president for the 2018-2019 academic year. And I'm here to introduce our amazing speaker, Kenneth B. Morris, Jr., co-founder and president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. Mr. Morris descends from two of the most influential names in American history. He is the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. Ken continues his family's legacy of anti-slavery and educational work as co-founder and president of the Atlanta-based nonprofit Frederick Douglass Family Initiative that works towards its mission to advance freedom through knowledge and strategic action. Ken has received an honorary doctorate degree of Humane Letters and a Bachelor's of Arts in Religion from the University of La Verne in California. In addition, he has received several awards, including the inaugural National Park Service Underground Railroad Network to Freedom's Frederick Douglass Underground Railroad Legacy Award, the Anne Frank Change the World Award from the Westmouth Center for Human Rights, the National Association of African Americans Honors Program Legacy Keeper Award, and many more. Ken is currently director of the Frederick Douglass Ireland Project and an ambassador for the nonprofit organization Human Rights First, while also serving as the commission chair of the Frederick Douglass Bicentennial Commission. He strongly believes, as did Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, that education is the pathway to freedom. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause for our speaker, Mr. Kenneth B. Morris, Jr.
Good morning. Thank you, Imani, for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. It's always so exciting to see when students put together programs, and it's been my honor to work with the Student Government Association on this program and to be here. Thank you all very much for honoring my great ancestor, Frederick Douglass, with this convocation. Today also happens to be his birthday. Last year, we celebrated the 200th anniversary of his birthday. It was his bicentennial. And tonight we're doing a culminating event at the Library of Congress to close out all of the great activities that we've had over the year. And if you don't know, the reason that we celebrate Black History Month in February was because of Dr. Carter G. Woodson saw that we needed to have more Black history in textbooks, and he started something called Negro History Week, and he chose the second week of February because it was Frederick Douglass's birthday on the 14th and Abraham Lincoln's birthday on the 12th. It evolved to what we now call Black History Month, so that is the reason that we're here this month, and it's a big day for Frederick Douglass and the family of Frederick Douglass. So thank you all for inviting me to be here. I have to thank Morgan James also for coordinating everything and making sure that I got here. Thank you for your fine, detailed instructions to make sure that I made it up to the stage. Also want to recognize some of my family members that are here, Morgan State professor and my cousin, Professor Dale Green. Please stand up and say hello. And then I've got a whole contingent of people that I'm so blessed to have love me and follow me around and listen to me speak. I'm sure probably some of you could do these remarks now that you've heard them so many times, but thank you for being here, and thank you all for being here. As I was introduced, I think I heard Imani say, did she say I'm the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass? And the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. Wow, that's a whole lot of greats. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to my ancestor, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel very far removed. And you might be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know a grandparent. Some of you may have even known a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglas, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old. And she met Frederick Douglass when she was about 8 years old. Now, she didn't know that she was going to grow up and marry his grandson, Joseph, but that's what happened. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, lived to be 95. And she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy, I spent all of my summers in a place called Highland Beach on the Chesapeake Bay, Highland Beach, Maryland. And it was a house where Frederick Douglass was supposed to spend his retirement years. It was built by my great-great-grandfather, Charles. And when he asked his father, he said, "Dad, are there any special features that you want in this house?" And Frederick said, "I want it to point in a certain direction, and I want you to put something at the top, a feature called the tower." Now, at the end of Frederick's life, he wanted to sit up in that tower and look back across the water, back across the bay, because on the other side you could see land. And that land is the eastern shore of Maryland, not too far from here, where he was born into slavery and where he toiled away in chains. Now, I think history is important for a lot of reasons. I think history is most important because we need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're headed. And here was a man at the end of his life who was the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American recorder of deeds, first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor, and the list goes on and on and on. And people would say, "Frederick, I need to know, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education?" And he would respond on occasion by saying, "My degree is written on my back." And so here he wanted to sit up in that house and look back to that land where he was born, and he never wanted to forget where he came from. He understood that we needed to know our history. And so I would sit on my great-grandmother Fanny's lap or at the knee of my Aunt Portia, and they would tell me firsthand stories. And my great-grandmother used to call Frederick Douglass the man with the great big white hair. And my Aunt Portia would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And several years ago, I was with a group of students, and they were sixth graders, and they were all looking at me kind of cross-eyed and with this perplexed look on their face, like, "Man, you are so far removed, and what does all of this history have to do with me? And why are you even here talking about these people that lived so long ago?" So I was trying to help them wrap their minds around the distance between the generations and to give them some context. And I had this thought that hands that actually touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand one person away from history. I can say I stand one person away from each man, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country. And so what I hope to do this morning is I hope to inspire you with the stories of my ancestors. And I'm going to talk about Booker T. Washington as well, because my mother always said to me, "Don't go to any event that's a Washington event and not talk about Douglass, and don't go to a Douglass event and not talk about Washington." So they're both a part of me, and their blood flows through my veins. And so I'm going to share some information about him as well. But what I hope to do is inspire you this morning with their stories, because they both understood from a very young age that education equals freedom. Education equals emancipation. Education equals liberation. And that is a message that is still as relevant today as it was all those years ago. And so for young people, and I know, we do a lot of work with K through 12 schools, and a lot of times our young people are facing challenges in their communities, and sometimes they think that these obstacles are too great to overcome, that the challenges are too insurmountable to overcome. And when we can look at the lives of the great heroes and heroines that came before us and see if they were able to overcome slavery, and the way that my ancestors did it was through education. Now, we know from our history it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. And Frederick Douglass never spent one day of his life in a classroom. But again, both of them understood that education was going to be their pathway to freedom. And so I'm going to share their stories so you can hear how they were able to do that at a time when your federal government said it's legal to own you and illegal to teach you. So both of my ancestors were born into slavery, but they would overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles to rise up to effect change in the lives of millions of people around the world. And we are a very different country today because of the contributions of both of my ancestors and many other heroes and heroines that came before us. So I get a couple of questions when people meet me for the first time. The first question is, so I know that Douglass and Washington were related. How is it you're related to both of them? Well, here's how it happened. It happened on my mother's side of the family. My mother, Nettie Washington Douglass, was born in Tuskegee, Alabama, which is the place where Booker T. Washington founded Tuskegee Normal School and Institute. Now, my grandparents, my mother's parents, happened to be on campus the same day, and they were rushing across to get to the other side, and they literally bumped into each other, didn't know that the other descended from an historic family. They fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married 3 months later. And my mom was a product of that relationship, and now I'm the father of 2 daughters, and I don't recommend that any of you young people in here, students, get married after having only known somebody for 3 months. But it truly was a love story, and perhaps it was meant to happen. And then the other question that I get is, so you're related to Douglass and to Washington? Well, what do you do? And they always follow that up with, and it better be good. So as you can imagine, there has been this weight of expectation that I've carried around in my life, and sometimes I have felt the pressure of trying to live up to the legacies of 2 of this country's greatest heroes. So Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, as I said, to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his master was his father. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was about 6 or 7 years old. Now, you'll notice that I'll use an age range when I talk about him because he didn't know how old he was. There were no birth certificates for people that were enslaved, and so he would have to guess later in life, and he pegged his birth year to 1817. It was determined later that it was probably closer to 1818, and again, he chose February 14th as his birthday because of his mother calling him her little Valentine. So around 6 or 7 years old, he didn't have a pair of pants or shoes. He used to sleep head first in an old cornmeal sack on cold winter nights with his feet hanging out because it was the only way he could try and keep himself warm. And in fact, when he wrote his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which was first published in 1845, he wrote in there that the pen with which I'm putting these words to the paper, I could rest in the cracks and fissures of my feet that were slow to close shut after all of those cold winter nights. He only saw his mother 4 or 5 times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields picking cotton from sunup to sundown, walk 12 miles in the middle of the night, and spend just a few moments with him until he would fall asleep. He was about a year old when he was taken from his mom. And then she would have to walk 12 miles back so she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was most likely going to face some sort of beating or whipping. He had 5 brothers and sisters who were like strangers to him. So you had this little boy who had no family, he had no home, and he had no country because he was not considered a citizen of the United States, being enslaved. But yet, in spite of all of that, he was able to rise up and to go on to effect positive change. Now, he did have something that happened in his life that changed the course of history for all of us. And I hope you listen closely to this story because it's at the foundation of the work that we do at Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives around human trafficking, prevention, education, and training of educators. And that was, he was chosen at about 8 years old from among all of the children on the plantation to go to Baltimore. So there's a connection to all of this right here where we are. He was chosen to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's brother. Now, the importance of this move was he was leaving in an environment where he wasn't going to be around people that could help him learn to read and write, but he was going to be in the big city now where he would be around free black children and he would be around poor white children. But what happened most importantly was when he got there, his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, had never had a slave before. And she was just this kind Christian lady who had a young son that she was teaching, and she saw this bright, eager young man in Frederick who was ready to learn, and she didn't know that it was illegal to teach him. She begins to teach him his ABCs. And that's all he needed, was a little bit of light, a little bit of knowledge shown into his mental darkness so that he could see his way out, so he could see his pathway out. But when his master found out about the lessons, he got angry, and he forbade the teachings, and he looked at young Frederick, and he looked at his wife, and this is the way Frederick understood the message when he wrote about it later in life, and he said, "I heard my master say, you cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." Did you all hear that message? It will unfit him to be a slave. And Frederick thought, he looked at his master and he said to himself, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge was power. That's a message that we hear today that is as relevant today, and education equals freedom. And so he would begin to teach himself to read and write. And he was very clever in the way that he went about doing this. Now remember, he's in the neighborhood with children, and he's interacting with children. And so he would, for instance, pick a stick up off the ground, and he would go up to somebody, and he was scratching the dirt or scratching the wall. Is this how you write an S? And they would take the stick away and say, no, Freddie B., this is how you draw an S, and he would file it away. He also would carry in his pocket bread, and he would trade bread for reading lessons. Now, he wrote in that narrative that he was always so hungry as a slave child. He always had this pit of hunger in his stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when he would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush and throw it into a trough similar to what pigs would eat out of. And Frederick and the other children would rush to that trough, some crawling on their hands and knees to eat what little food was in there, to eat like pigs, to eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He did not own himself. He was no better than the cattle, the sheep, the pigs, and the horses. So if you think about this idea of this little boy who was always so hungry that he would trade bread for reading lessons, what does that say about the value of education? And I had a group of elementary school kids say to me, you know, Mr. Morris, so what you're telling me is he would rather feed his mind and have his stomach go empty. And that's exactly what he did. And so he continued to teach himself to read and write, and he would eventually read the Bible. Now, the Bible was an interesting book for him to come into contact with for many reasons, because he couldn't understand how his master could put on a suit every Sunday and go to church and in the Word and the Bible and cherry-picked scriptures find justification to come back to the plantation, brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, plunder, and exploit his property. Frederick couldn't wrap his mind around what he was now starting to differentiate between what he would call the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ versus the slave-holding religion Christianity of the land. He's starting to do exactly what his master feared. He is unfitting himself to be enslaved. He's starting to ask critical questions about his condition of oppression and enslavement. Questions like, why am I a slave? And why do you own me? And how come you know your birthday and I don't know my birthday? Now, when I talk about history, I like to jump back and forth between the past and the present, because history is not just about the past. It's about the present and the future, and it also helps us inform ourselves in the world in which we live. And so it's important to always think about history when we're looking at these contemporary issues and challenges that we face today. And so maybe a Syrian refugee might say, well, why am I a refugee? Maybe some of us would say, how come I'm born into a certain zip code and you're born into another zip code, and you have more economic opportunity, you have more opportunity for education, and I have a hard time getting health care and you don't. So these are critical questions, and in the work that we do, I'll talk about a project called 1 Million Abolitionists a little bit later in my remarks, but the idea is to get young people to start thinking about their condition, to start thinking about how communities of color are oppressed and how racism runs systemically throughout American life and throughout every institution. And so in the same way that Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists began to look at this legal institution of slavery and say, how do we go about dismantling that? How do we bring that down? Now, we're living in some tough times now. We're living in a climate that is divisive, and the political rhetoric by so-called leaders and making people an other. Same thing that they did back in the 19th century. They would talk about slaves being better off in slavery, that these were people of African descent. They can't take care of themselves. They're better off. At least they're getting some measured level of care. Listen to the songs that they sing, trying to justify making them an other so that they could exploit them, rip their humanity from them, and make money off of their backs. These are the same things that we hear in the news today. Does it sound familiar? Down at the border, these are rapists, these are criminals. There's a caravan coming to infest and invade our country. So it's not just about the past, it's also about the present and the future. And so we want young people to start thinking in the same way, start to unfit themselves to be oppressed and to be taken advantage of, and to also use as inspiration the tangible examples of the people that came before us to again say, if they were able to do that, then there's no challenge in my life that I can't overcome. It becomes history. History becomes alive. It becomes living history. So now I don't have time to go through the whole Frederick Douglass story, but what I will say is that at the age of 20, he had been sent back to Baltimore. After he got to this point where his master couldn't tell him what to do, he was sent away to be broken like an animal to get him to submit. He was eventually sent back to Baltimore, where he worked as a ship caulker on the shipyards on the docks of Baltimore. At the age of 20, September 3rd, 1838, he would disguise himself as a sailor and carry with him protection papers, and finally escape slavery, first by train and by boat. And he would land in New York City. Now, I want to introduce to you my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass. We do a lot of talking about history and talking mostly about the men, but there would be no Frederick Douglass had there not been an Anna Murray Douglass. She was born free in Baltimore. And as he was moving around the city, working faithfully, taking his money back to his master every single day, they would meet at some point. And as they're starting to fall in love, she was really one of the first people to put the seed of thought in his mind that you are not meant to be a slave, Frederick. And as they're falling deeper in love, she said, I don't want our kid's father to be a slave. And so history is important. And we are making history today. And what do I mean by that? Well, had Anna not planted that seed of thought in his mind, had she not sold her personal belongings to help finance his escape, had she not helped him with the sailor's disguise, then we would be a very different country today. History would have taken a different course had we not had the contributions of Frederick Douglass. And so what I mean by making history today, we can change the course of history by our interaction today. What we learn from each other, what we take beyond the walls of this auditorium will reverberate into our schools, our communities, our churches, the organizations that we serve. And just the way that we talk to each other or the encouragement that we give to each other, we can change that course of history in the same way Anna changed the course of history for all of us. So Anna and Frederick would get married with the help of conductors on the Underground Railroad. They would make their way up to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they would settle in. He would change his name to Douglas to make it harder for his master to come and recapture his property. And then they would begin their life together. Now, the importance of Frederick Douglass at this time was He had been reading abolitionist newspapers. He had been reading William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. And so he went to an anti-slavery meeting on Nantucket Island. And Garrison was there and other abolitionists, and when they heard that they had this fugitive slave in the audience, they asked, Frederick, will you just stand up and will you just tell the audience your story? And again, he wrote later, he said, I was so nervous to speak in front of a white audience for the first time that my knees were knocking together, I was shaking from every limb, but he stood up and he had a natural gift for communication. He was charismatic, he was eloquent, he was theatrical, he was funny in his delivery, but what he was doing most importantly was he was telling the audience and eventually telling the country and the world a firsthand account of what it was like to be enslaved. He's trying to shatter the notion that was in the public consciousness, as I mentioned earlier, that they're not worthy of freedom, they're not worthy of citizenship. And so now he's standing up and he's saying, you cannot deny that I'm a man, and here is my story. So the Garrisonians asked him to continue along with them, and he would go from town to town just telling his story. And it changed the course of abolition because people started to see a human being behind all of that stuff, all of that other that they had been given. Well, now he started to have a problem. And that problem was people started to doubt that he had ever been enslaved. Again, remember, in their mind, they know what a slave looks like, they think, and what a slave sounds like. And here you've got this man that is just shattering that notion that you have. So they started calling him a fraud. So in order to prove that he was who he said he was, he wrote his first autobiography, The Narrative, again published in 1845. It became an instant bestseller. Now he had another problem, and that's the last thing that you want if you're trying to hide from your master is the notoriety of a best-selling book, because it made him a celebrity and a household name, and so his master knew where he was going to be just about every minute of the day. So he was encouraged to flee to Europe for a couple of years as a cooling off period. He spoke out about slavery in the United States, and then he was able to get some support from some of his European abolitionist friends. They pooled their money together and purchased his freedom from his master for $711, and he was able to go back to the United States and really begin his work. He would settle in Rochester, New York, where he would publish the North Star newspaper, which became the leading abolitionist voice. And for 25 years, he and Anna and their 5 children lived in Rochester, and he would eventually settle in Washington, D.C. when he goes into his statesman years. He was an advisor to presidents, particularly Abraham Lincoln, and pushing Lincoln to move faster toward emancipation. And then, of course, we would need the 13th Amendment to make slavery illegal. So that's Frederick Douglass's story in a not-so-quite tight nutshell. Booker T. Washington benefited from the work of Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. He was freed at 9 years old when President Lincoln signed that document. He wanted to go to school so badly that he worked in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia at night so he could begin his lessons during the day. And so he would work hard every single night and then get those lessons during the day and read those books. And one night when he was in the coal mines, he heard these 2 older gentlemen talking about this place called Hampton Institute in Virginia. And they were talking about it as a place where formerly enslaved people could go and get an education. They can get an industrial education. They could learn a trade. They could learn a tool. And so Booker T. Washington had no idea what that type of education meant for him in his life, but what he was hearing from these men, he thought, literally, Hampton must be heaven. And so he would make it clear that he wanted to go to Hampton, and so he would eventually save enough money, and with the help of people in the community, he would make a 500-mile walk to go to school at the age of 16. That walk took a long time. And again, this is a great message for young people, because there was no challenge too great for him to overcome, no obstacle too great for him to overcome to get that education. He had to take odd jobs along the way. He slept outside, he slept under bridges. But when he would finally get to Hampton, he would go straight to the headmistress of the school and say, I want to go to school here. And she looked at him, and his clothes were torn, he was dirty, he was disheveled. None of that mattered to him because he wanted an education so badly. But she looked at him and she said, young man, you're not worthy for admittance into this institution. Go on about your business. Well, he wasn't going to take no for an answer. And so he came back the next day, and she shooed him away. He came back. He kept coming back, and he kept coming back. And finally, she said, okay, Booker, you're driving me crazy here. I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove yourself. There's a dirty classroom down the hallway. I want you to go down there and clean that, and let's see what you can do. Well, he had learned the value of hard work, working those long hours at night in those mines, and now he was going to be able to put his skills to the test. And so he cleaned and he cleaned, and when she finally came in to do the white glove test, which for you young people was a test that older people used to do to make sure you cleaned well, and so she's looking for dirt on the windowsills and the tables and the chairs, and not only couldn't she find dirt, she couldn't find one speck of dust. And so she looked at Booker and she said, okay, you will do for admittance into this institution, and not only that, we're going to give you the job as a janitor so you can work your way through college. And so he would start at 16 years old, he would graduate 4 years later. He came back to Hampton to teach, and while he was there teaching, he got word that there was this place down in Tuskegee, Alabama, where a group had some money to start a school. And they were looking for a principal. They were looking for a founder of the school. And word got back to Booker T. Washington. Word got back to them that Booker T. was their man. Booker T. accepted that challenge, and he rushed down to Tuskegee, excited to get started. And as he looks around, he's looking for a schoolhouse or a church, somewhere where he could have a classroom to facilitate conversation and lessons. But there was nothing but farmland as far as the eye could see, and dirt. He didn't get discouraged. He started recruiting students, and he started getting them excited about getting an education. And one of the first things he taught them to do was to make bricks. He taught them to make bricks so that they could build their own school. And so if you do a Google search today, later today, you can see photographs of students building what is now Tuskegee University brick by brick. Again, this is another great message. This is how badly our ancestors wanted to get an education. And so Booker's philosophy, for those of you that have studied the debate between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, I know some of you may have in high school or you have in college. And the way that I try and think about this is they had two separate philosophies, very differing philosophies for the advancement of their people. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery. He came from the fields with a till under his arms. Du Bois was born free in the city, and he came with books under his arms. So there's no doubt that they would have differing philosophies in the way to go about advancing their people. One worked from the top down, Du Bois, and the other worked from the bottom up, Washington, and advancement met in the middle. So Booker understood that you couldn't start reaching for the higher aims in life until you could meet your basic needs in life. And so for people that had been enslaved and oppressed for hundreds of years, education at Tuskegee meant starting with the basics, and sometimes that meant hygiene, teaching them how to brush their teeth, how to tie their shoes. But what he taught them most importantly was a trade. He taught them how to farm the land, how to be an entrepreneur, how to be a dressmaker, because he understood that coming out of hundreds of years of oppression and enslavement, you weren't going to get people just to change their racist ideas because slavery had been outlawed. So you had the question, the moral question that some white abolitionists faced, that yes, slavery was morally wrong and we want to abolish it, but then there was this whole question about black equality. Just because you thought slavery was wrong didn't mean that you thought black people were equal to white people. And certainly if you're in the South and you were a slave owner, you were pro-slavery, there was no way that you were just going to change your ideas, and Booker T. Washington understood that. So rather than demanding that they change their racist ways, he showed freed African Americans how they could change themselves, how they could overcome obstacles, develop strength of character, and rise by their own efforts to honorable positions of respect, but most importantly, self-esteem. So Washington was a leader who brought stability in a time of transition from enslavement to freedom, and it may be said that he is the person that bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. And so you have Frederick Douglass, who was the father of the Civil Rights Movement. And then Booker T. Washington takes up the mantle of leadership and leads us into the Civil Rights Movement. And so I've always known that I descended from both of these men, but I never celebrated it. I never embraced it. I mentioned in my opening remarks that at times it's felt like a blessing, but it's also felt like an obligation or a burden, and carrying around this weight of expectation. And I spent most of my life running away from all of this. I didn't want anything to do with it. I started to notice when I was 6 years old that my ancestors were on statues, and they were on money. They were on postage stamps. There were schools named for them, bridges named for them, libraries named for them. And everywhere I turned, I could feel myself in this long, vast shadow of two great American heroes. And I would ask my classmates, are your ancestors on statues? And they say, no. Are your ancestors on money? I remember when I was in that beach house, there was this larger-than-life portrait of Frederick Douglass at the top of the stairs. And we've all seen the images of him. I'm not talking about the grandfatherly, white-haired prophet statesman that's looking away from the camera that history has given us, that the power structure has given us a sanitized and deodorized Douglass, somebody that's safe. I'm talking about the radical abolitionist that was looking directly into the camera by design. He became the most photographed American of the 19th century, photographed more than Lincoln, more than Grant, more than General Custer. His only contemporaries in the world that were photographed more than he was the British royal family. And that's because he understood that this new technology that he was coming of age with, photography, he could help use to make his arguments. In the same way, his speeches and his anti-slavery writings would help push the abolitionist movement forward. He said, when you look at a photograph of me, you're never going to be able to deny that I'm a man worthy of freedom and citizenship. He also said, you're not going to ever look at a photograph of me and think that I'm a happy, amiable fugitive. Remember, he's trying to shatter that notion. He's trying to counteract all of the caricatures, the racist caricatures and other negative imagery that was out there about people of African descent. So he was very strategic in the way that he looked into the camera. But as a boy, I remember looking at that portrait, and he's looking stern and serious, and I'm thinking, man, you look mean. And I'm glad I didn't know you. And as I would try and sneak past that portrait, you know what would happen? His eyes would follow me. And by the time I would get down to the end of the hallway, I could feel his steely glare burning like fire on the back of my neck. And I always imagined in my 5-year-old imagination this booming baritone voice bellowing down on me saying, "You will do great things, young man." And again, that was a lot of pressure. I ran away from it for most of my life until the year 2005. And that's when I read a National Geographic magazine. And the cover story was 21st Century Slaves. It was about human trafficking. It was about modern-day slavery today. And I looked at that headline and reacted the way I think most people do the first time they hear about the existence of human trafficking and modern-day slavery. And I thought slavery had ended with the work of Douglass and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. But as I read that article and further researched articles, I found that slavery still existed all over the world, in every country, including right here in the United States, including right here in Baltimore, taking the form of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And so as I'm reading this article, my daughters at the time were 12 and 9 years old. And I was reading a research paper about a young girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia. At 12 years old, she was forced to service countless men almost every single day. And as I'm reading this, my mind just starts going crazy, and down the hallway, I could hear my girls getting ready for bed. And I'm thinking to myself, that's what young girls and boys should be doing, is they should be getting tucked safely into their beds, not being forced into bed to service some sick individual. And as I put the article down, I walked in to say goodnight to my daughters, and I had this moment where I didn't feel like I could even look them in the eyes. I didn't feel that I could look them in the eyes and just walk away and not do something about this. And all of this energy just started welling up inside of me, and my mind is just bouncing all over the place. And I started to think, well, we've got this history, this platform that my ancestors have built through struggle and through sacrifice. If we could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry, perhaps we can do something about this. So how do we fit into the modern day anti-trafficking movement? Well, we looked at the legacy of the great abolitionist and the legacy of the great educator, and if we combine those, abolition through education, through education in classrooms and training of educators, we can unfit communities to allow slavery to thrive and exist, with students being the starting point. So we started to go into schools and we started talking about this history. And then we would ask the students to look through the prism of history at contemporary human rights issues. In this case, it was modern day slavery, but when you look at issues in communities, it all overlaps. So we started having conversations about mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex, and school to pipeline system. We start talking about institutionalized racism, and all of these conversations are percolating in the classroom. And then once the students would say, well, wait a minute, now that we know a little bit about this history and we know about what's going on today, what can we do to become modern day abolitionists? And so we developed service learning curricula for the classroom so that once students go in and learn about this information, then they can go into their communities and do volunteer projects, civic engagement projects, service learning projects to address an issue that they're most passionate about. Now, I would like everybody in here to be passionate about fighting against human trafficking, but in interacting with tens of thousands of students over the past 13 years that I've been doing this work, I found that you guys are passionate about a lot of things. Some of you are passionate about the environment, passionate about eradicating homelessness or poverty, fighting for the rights for women and girls. Whatever your passion is, I hope that you will use your talent, your intellect, and your creativity to address an issue. So if you're a writer, use the power of the pen like Frederick Douglass did as a journalism, and the North Star paper as a journalist. If you are an artist, how can you use that medium, whether it be through film or art or song, doing plays? How can you tell your community and the country what this issue looks like through that type of lens? And so these are the types of conversations that we're having in the classroom. We're doing a big project in California where we are bringing in training of educators on how to identify and recognize signs of human trafficking in the classroom. And then we are empowering the students, again, to go out into the community. And so this is institutionalized, ongoing knowledge. We worked with the California State Legislature to pass laws that mandate this type of education in the classroom. So in California, it starts in the 5th grade. It continues in the 7th grade, the 9th grade, and then in the 11th grade, it's in a U.S. history class because that's when the service component kicks in. This is something that we would like to see be implemented all over the country. It's an online education that teachers can get continuing education credits when they complete it. We also worked in Washington to pass last month the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act. This was based off of the first legislation that was introduced in 2000 called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. When we started this work, there was only an effort on helping victims, which of course we need to do, and we need more resources in order to be able to serve and rescue victims. But there was no proactive approach to trying to prevent this in the first place. So what we saw is we've got this cycle of exploitation that's just churning, and as well-meaning as we are as modern-day abolitionists, if we're not preventing new victims from being spit into that cycle, are we really doing the right thing? And so after 20-plus years, that act gets reauthorized every 4 years, and we were able to get lawmakers to add into it the word prevention, which helps start a conversation, but most importantly, it helps appropriate funds. And so in that legislation, we were able to get $78 million to go toward age-appropriate education in the classroom over 4 years. So Frederick Douglass's legacy still continues today in the work that we do, in the students that I interact with who have been introduced to his legacy either through his first autobiography or through excerpts in the classroom. And being his descendant, my whole life I've had people of all ages come up to me, sometimes with tears in their eyes, because they want to tell me how much Frederick Douglass's words inspired them. They inspired them to be and do anything possible. And so they would come up to me as a little boy, and I had a hard time trying to wrap my mind, understand the emotional connection that so many had to my ancestors. Why were old, gray-haired people crying and trying to hug me and pinch my cheeks and kiss me and pat me on the head? And it wasn't until this lady told me many years later, she said, I am the leader that I am today because of Frederick Douglass's inspiration. Or Booker T. Washington, I read his Up From Slavery. And if I could thank them in person, I would, but because I can't, you become the conduit to saying thank you. So knowing in my spirit and my soul that their words can impact lives today, we decided to publish a special bicentennial edition of his narrative. And we wanted to make his words accessible to young people today, to students, K through 12 and college and university students. We have an introduction in this book by Brian Stevenson, whom you may know as the founder and CEO of the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery, Alabama. He, along with Michelle Alexander, who wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, he's a leading voice around talking about mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex. He's also a New York Times best-selling author. He wrote a great book called Just Mercy. And he wrote a powerful introduction for us where he spares no detail because we want students who have been given a whitewashed history where the contributions of people of color and Native Americans have been erased from the freedom narrative. We want young people to understand the contributions that we've made. And so he draws a direct line from slavery through 90 to 100 years of Jim Crow, separate but equal, housing discrimination, Voting Rights Act, racial lynching and terror, all the way up to his issue that he talks about and the prison industrial complex. And then I wrote a foreword where I talk about history and how greatness flows through all of us. And then we have some other pieces in there from students that wrote blurbs about how, again, these words impacted them. And so we're really proud of this book. We created a project around it called 1 Million Abolitionists, and we're working to give away 1 million copies of this book to young people everywhere over the next few years, or however long it takes us to get there. And so history lives in each of us. History doesn't just live in me, because I descend from two people that we've heard of, but history lives in each and every one of you. I had a 10-year-old girl say to me one time, she was so excited to tell me this, she was bouncing off the walls and up and down, she said, Mr. Morris, I researched my family tree, and I found that my great-great-great-great-grandmother, 4 greats, was born into slavery. She taught herself to read and write in secret. She escaped, and she became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist. And she used that word, philanthropist. And so she said, so do you know what all of this means? And before I had a chance to respond, she said, it means I have greatness flowing through my veins, just like you do. We all have greatness flowing through our veins. We may not descend from somebody that we've heard of, but we stand on the shoulders of those that walk before us, and we walk in their shoes. So history lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forward. Because we are the sons and daughters. We're the grandsons and granddaughters. We're the products of slavery. This country is the product of slavery. This country is also the product of the abolition of slavery. And from Frederick Douglass, we learned that we have a right to be free. And from Booker T. Washington, we learned how to make our way in the world as free citizens. And from Martin Luther King, Jr., we learned as free citizens, we have the same rights as all citizens. When I was growing up, the challenges faced by great people like my ancestors were apparent to me because it just so happens their blood flows through my veins. But the fact is, all of us, we live far from the cotton fields. And we're worried more about our favorite sports team winning a ball game on Sunday than we are about the threat of being beaten by our overseers. And we live in modern times, and the echoes of slavery they're hard to hear from where we stand. But if we all listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from the slaves of today. And if we listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from all of the young people out there that need hope, they need inspiration. They need to know that they descend from greatness. The reason that we're all here is because of our ancestors and how they survived. And our young people don't know where they come from, but it's not their fault. I understand why stories haven't been passed down, especially if you descend from people that were enslaved. There was no plan for emancipation when 4 million people of African descent were freed, the last of them in 1865. Just go on out on your own, try and figure it out. There's no counseling. There's no post-traumatic stress disorder designation. They spent the first few years just trying to reconnect with family that they had been separated from. Many didn't know how to read and write. They didn't own anything. All they had was the burlap on their backs, and this is what they had to deal with on their own. When I was working on the book Picturing Frederick Douglass, which is the book where we made the case that he was the most photographed American of the 19th century, all of the pictures he was looking into the camera except for one photograph. It was the third in the series. He was about 23 years old when he took it, 24. And I noticed that he was looking away from the camera and he's looking down. And there was something that struck me about that photo. And did some research with some of the scholars that worked on the book, and we found a letter that he had written during that time period to a fellow fugitive slave. And in that letter he wrote, "I felt so ugly today that I couldn't even look at myself in the glass, in the mirror." And it hit me because I had always thought about him as this superhero. But he dealt with 20 years of enslavement and trauma, and you can see it in this photograph. And it got me thinking about, this is a man who self-emancipated himself through education, who went on to do great things, but he was trying to deal with this trauma that was inside of him. So I know why the stories haven't been passed down. But what I have seen is that when a young person knows that they descend from greatness, you see them sit up straighter in their chairs. You see them more empowered to want to go out and live up to the obligation that's been passed on to them. I've seen it firsthand in tens of thousands of students. And so we need to tell these stories. And so when we listen close enough, that's when change will happen. So I'm going to close by just reading a little bit, an excerpt from Brian's introduction, because it really speaks to the work that we do and what we're trying to do with this project. I understand that this is a lofty goal. To get to 1 million copies, we can't do that on our own, so we need your help. We need the help of community. And we have actually distributed a number of books in the Baltimore area, and I should take this opportunity to thank my friend Gabby, who's sitting here. Stand up, Gabby. I know you don't like the attention. But she and her family have personally financed these books, and we've given, I should have known the number before I came out, but it's definitely over 1,000. It could be closer to 2,000 books in Baltimore schools and some organizations. And we want to continue that. We want to do 10,000 books in Baltimore. And there's also a curricula that goes along with it so that we're not just handing a book to a young person and giving them no support, because I know some of them, they'll make a doorstop out of it. We don't want this to be a doorstop. Let other books gather dust on your shelf. Take this book to a protest, take it to a meeting, tell people that you know who Frederick Douglass was and is, and that he would know who you are. And use it, because his words are as relevant today to our challenges and issues as they were all those years ago. In fact, you can read his speeches, read this book, and it sounds like he was writing those words for today's challenges. And so we want to, again, inspire young people to believe that they can do and be anything possible. So in closing, Brian writes, Frederick Douglass wrote that, quote, "Education means emancipation. It means light and liberty. It means the uplifting of the soul of man into the glorious light of truth, the light by which men can only be made free," end quote. And then Brian continues and he writes, "We're living at a time when we need the glorious light of truth, people who are willing to stand when others say sit down, We need people committed to equality who will speak when others say, be quiet. It can be difficult to know how to face some of these overwhelming challenges. Let the words and life of Frederick Douglass show you the way. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Morris. And to follow up with that, Morgan and I would like to challenge everyone to wake up and strive to be your ancestors' wildest dreams.
Definitely. So on behalf of the Student Government Association and our senior class, we would like to present Mr. Morris with this wonderful certificate of recognition that reads, for his contribution to the legacy of Frederick Douglass and serving as the keynote speaker for the Student Government Association's Frederick Douglass Convocation, February 14th, 2019. Signed by Imani Majors, senior class president, and Morgan James, senior class vice president.
We can step up front.
You want to take a picture?
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And now we will have our class, senior class, Mr. and Miss Senior, come to the stage. Give them a round of applause.
Thank you all for coming out today. We want to give a special thanks to Mr. Morris for coming out.
And to piggyback on that, I want to thank you personally for coming, because it allows, speeches like this really allow you to think of history and where we come from and where we can be, especially that we are at HBCU and education equals freedom. I want us seniors and just students in general to remember to overcome, break barriers, teach and exceed your goals, and remember that history lives in each and every one of us.
So a quick reminder for our graduating seniors that are in the building, the grad applications are closely coming to an end and are closing. So please sign up for graduation class of 2019. And that's all. Yes. So thank you all again.
And now we will introduce the selection for the alma mater to close out our program. Can everyone please stand?
I'm gonna take